And I'm Rihanna, and welcome back to Fresh Off the Broke.
Fresh Off the Broke is about personal experiences growing up Asian American in a predominantly white community, Asian media, and Asian pop culture in general. Race has always been a sensitive topic. Every day, there are debates over race. With our podcast, we intend to shed light on the experiences of first-generation Asian immigrants, not put them on a pedestal.
We understand that race isn't everything, but there should be an acknowledgement of people of color, the knowledge gap, and the racial divide that will ideally be broken. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into the episode. Today, we will be discussing the white man's burden.
So, Rihanna, for our listeners that might not know what that means, would you like to explain what the white man's burden is?
Sure. So, by definition, the concept of the white man's burden is the task that white colonizers believed they had to impose their civilization on the Black inhabitants of their colonies. Now, I know it says Black in the definition, but this is just a general thing for all people of color or all places that got colonized.
And we'll touch on this later, but it also connects very heavily with like savior complexes and like the idea of like the white savior.
And it's funny because I actually thought of this episode with that in mind because, as you guys may know, it is summer right now. Yay, fun, finally. And Asian vacation destinations are very popular, or just places that aren't Europe or the Western world. Quote unquote, exotic places are very popular. And I don't know about you guys, but I've seen a lot of people who go to these places, which some of them, they do go to third world countries, and they say things like, oh, I traveled to insert third world country here, and the people look like they were struggling, or like I was really helping the people, like they looked so poor. And I'm glad like I was able to give them service by like staying there or buying from them, stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. This is terrible, but I remember I've heard people say, especially very rich people, talk about how it's humbling.
Oh God, that term,
and
humbling.
It's so disrespectful because I remember I saw this video one time where it was interviews with these rich people, and it was a Jubilee video. It was one of those videos where they had the lines on the ground, and it was like, I strongly disagree, agree, blah blah. And they were talking about, you know, like being perceived as rich and blah blah, and starting from quote unquote the bottom. And I remember this one guy, he was saying how he was jealous of some of the other people in the room because they were saying how they had experienced like hardship or they had experienced poverty before. And he was saying that he was jealous of them because he wished that he had had that experience, because he thought that, I mean, I'm probably paraphrasing, so don't take what I'm saying word for word, but he was saying stuff about how like he wished that he had that experience, that he had gone through that, because I guess it would have helped him build character or just like help with his work ethic in some way. And he was saying how he travels to third world countries in order to get in that mindset, or in order to understand. And so he was jealous of those people because I guess they didn't have to do that.
Yeah, they just had experience in their own lives. They didn't have to travel, go through the hassle of traveling.
And the harm of traveling, like environmental harm and stuff. It's such an out of touch thing to say. And I mean, this whole episode is essentially just about how this mindset and this concept is very out of touch. But gosh, I just can't imagine people saying stuff like that about how it's humbling.
God.
and how it's like, oh, I have to be reminded and put back in my place.
Yeah. Ugh, God. Also, just to note, there are places in Asia where, yes, it is humbling to see the people. However, for the most part, people don't travel like vacation wise to these places. Like they're just going to like nice resorts and saying, oh, it's humbling to see the people living off the land,
Yeah,
essentially.
exactly.
Like, yes, there are slums in these areas, but this is not this is not a vacation destination, you know.
For sure. And it kind of ties into a previous episode of ours talking about transnational gentrification
Mm-hmm.
because of how people will travel to these types of countries and then they'll be very isolated in
Yeah.
resorts. And so I guess you could say there's two, I don't know if I want to say angles because then it seems like, I don't know, one's good and one's bad.
Mm-hmm.
But there's two types of experiences per se, where there's one where it's very isolated and they will talk about how people look like they were struggling from the outside. Like, oh, I was
Mm-hmm.
looking out my window and I see this.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's those people that travel like to the third world countries, like to, I guess, where it's truly humbling.
Yeah.
And then you see it like eye to eye.
Yeah, they actually see the people and interact with people, and
Yeah.
that is different.
Mm-hmm.
Just to make it clear.
For sure.
So we pretty much just touched upon it now, but the whole concept of the white man's burden has pretty much just been rooted into our like Western culture. And historically, it all pretty much boils down to colonization. Yeah, I mean, these people believed that they were doing something good by helping these quote unquote uncivilized people and doing something better for them, and thinking like, oh, it's such a hassle for us to be doing this. It's like
Yeah,
a
they're
burden on our
civilizing
part.
them.
Yeah, but like we're doing this for the betterment of them. This isn't for us. This is for them, you know. Um and yeah, like this, we can see branches of it throughout society still to this day, even though like I'm gonna read out a couple, like a poem later, and it sounds very, very old, like old English, but it's still very relevant to this day. Ugh.
And like we were saying earlier, we were talking about how we're going to touch on white savior complex. And a lot of this does play into this whole idea of saving people
Mhm.
because you're meant to or because you have to. And well, first off, if I can give you a definition of white savior complex, if you're not sure what that is, to give you a general idea of what the white savior complex is and what it means, I have a definition here from health.com that explains it as an ideology that is acted upon when a white person from a position of superiority attempts to help or rescue a BIPOC, Black, Indigenous person of color, person or community.
Mhm.
And you can see very clearly here that they say like a white person from a position of superiority, they're essentially looking down on these people that they're helping and rescuing, because it's almost, and I mean, there's definitely people, white or not, from privileged background that out of the goodness of their heart want to help other people that
Mhm.
don't have the same level of privilege of them
Mhm.
or disenfranchised communities. But what we're talking about specifically here is people that are helping these people because it's almost like it's just so sad to see them like this.
Yeah.
I just have to, and it's burdening on them, hence
Yeah.
white man burden.
Mhm.
And it's very much, I mean, even if we don't talk about it from a long historical standpoint, even today, sometimes when I see, for example, LinkedIn profiles or whatever, I will see people, the way they write about their volunteer experiences
Oh
on
God, yeah.
LinkedIn or on social media, they'll say the most outrageous, or they'll just describe it in the most outrageous way when they're
Mhm.
talking about volunteering at charity or doing some type of non-profit work.
Mhm.
And the way that they describe the kids that they're working with, or the way that they describe how they fit into that environment. And by fit, I don't mean blend in. I just mean like the role that that person played in that environment. It just feels so patronizing to read,
Mhm.
and it's gives you such a weird, uncomfortable feeling because you're thinking, how could they have written and posted that?
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel real what they say when they're talking about, for example, tutoring kids that for free because they can't afford
Yeah.
private classes and stuff like that. The way that they'll write about it and the way that they describe these kids just feels so wrong.
Yeah.
And even when it comes to stuff like scholarships for community involvement, I've come across people that describe what they do or that brag about what they do also in a very uncomfortable way.
Yeah.
It's just the way that they talk about the kids, the way that they say what they do. There's nothing inherently wrong with tutoring people or with doing this, that, and the other thing. But the way that they go about describing it, you can so tell that they're subconsciously or not inserting themselves in a way where it's almost like they're saving these kids.
Yeah.
These kids are just so helpless.
Mhm. And they just
And
had
just,
to.
yeah, it's just such a pity.
Ugh.
And it's just so disrespectful, and also because I can't imagine just, I don't know how detached you have to be to write and think something like that.
Mhm.
Like I remember a while ago, I had these classmates complaining about community service or like volunteer hours and stuff like that because they hadn't gotten much or they hadn't done much. And they were concerned about, for example, getting scholarships or getting
Oh my
accepted
God.
into certain university programs. And they were complaining about how they didn't do anything, right?
Mhm.
And the thing is, they could have gotten out and found something to volunteer at or something to do.
Mhm.
But instead, they were sitting there making fun of people that volunteered at food banks.
Mhm. I remember this.
And I was sitting there just thinking, what on earth? What is so funny about a person that volunteered at a food bank? It was so strange and just so, because they were complaining about how the pandemic had affected their chances of doing, or I guess even signing up for something, even though at least as described by them, it didn't seem like they had wanted to do something in the first place.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I guess it caught up on them that, because you know how some people, they don't do any volunteer service and then they realize, oh, I have to graduate.
Yeah.
Or, oh, I need something to make me look good on a piece of paper. And I don't even know how this came up, but someone had brought up food bank, and then they just all started laughing and making fun of people that volunteer at food banks. What's so funny about volunteering at a food bank? Genuinely though, I just can't think, even if we take away the part about helping people or whatever about the community, what about working at a food bank is funny?
To them, apparently a lot.
It's so weird, like making it seem like it was so embarrassing.
So going back to a historical perspective on this, there is a very famous poem called The White Man's Burden. It was created in 1899 by Rudyard Kipling. And this poem is about the Philippine-American War, which happened from 1899 to 1902. And it basically extorts the United States to assume colonial control of the Philippine people and their country. And I think it would be great to read this out.
Go ahead.
I will say, disclaimer, I'm probably gonna stumble upon my words a little bit because it is worded in Old English, so a little hard for me, at least. Okay. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness, unfluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. That's just the first stanza. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wharves of peace, fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly, bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rules of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living, and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of hosts ye humor, us slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen peoples shall weigh your gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days. The lightly proffered laurel, the easy, ungrudged praise, comes now to search your manhood through all the thankless years, cold-edged with dear-bought wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Now, that was a lot.
Thank you
I know.
For your reading.
Thank you for listening. And just, you guys can read a bit more about it on Wikipedia. We have a link in the description, but there are a couple quotes from some people on Wikipedia. Now, this quote is from, I believe it's from David Cody, and it's about the poem. It's just, the implication, of course, was that the empire existed not for the benefit, economic or strategic or otherwise, of Britain itself, but in order that primitive peoples incapable of self-government could, with British guidance, eventually become civilized and Christianized. Now, that was an explanation of the poem. Outright said, Britain believed, or these people believed, that people in the Philippines were primitive, incapable of self-government, and could eventually become civilized and Christianized with British guidance. Now, just a quick little history about the Philippine-American War. So originally, the Philippines was colonized by the Spaniards, right? And
Mhm.
the Americans were like, hey, we can help you get rid of Spain. And the Philippines, like, they were under like colonization from Spain like for quite a bit, right? So they're like, yes, help. Americans came, helped, got rid of Spain for them, and then decided that they also would like to take over all of a sudden. So during this time is when this poem came out, basically to show that like we need to colonize these people, even though they just like got rid of Spanish rule. But apparently the US at the time, so under British rule, was like, nope, we need to take over for them and help these people. Um, did they help at all? No, not at all. But yeah, that was the White Man's Burden poem. And I actually talked to my parents about this, and they had never heard of it. And when I read it out to them, they were both just like, very typical. I'm not surprised that this exists, but they were surprised they never heard about it. And I'm also surprised that like we've never heard about it like in school and stuff. There's so many
I
tiny
mean,
things. Well, yeah, I'm not surprised, but I'm surprised, like it's just disappointing to read these things and like see all the propaganda
of course.
and have not been educated about it whatsoever, like completely in
Uh-huh.
the dark. I just happened to stumble upon it. Like
Yeah.
this is terrible. And like it's crazy to see that this is what the US did before, and yet the
Mhm.
US holds such a large part in like pop culture and like standards for things, and how like the American dream is played out in all of these, not just the Philippines, but like all of these other countries that the US has pretty much screwed over.
Mhm.
It's crazy to just think about that. And just reading the poem as a Filipino person makes me feel really gross. But like
For sure.
again, not surprised that this was a whole thing. Oh God.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, we're in Canada, and in terms of Canadian history classes, we barely
Yeah,
learn about this the stuff that Canada has done. I mean,
the
we have a
absolute
whole
horrors.
we have a whole episode that does not cover everything, of course,
No.
but we do have an episode that covers some stuff
Yeah.
about Chinese Canadian, Filipino Canadian, just like
Mm-hmm.
some we talk about some of the hidden Asian Canadian
Mm-hmm.
history that doesn't get properly covered, and talk
Mm-hmm.
about like we talk about the way that the Government of Canada website glosses over certain
Oh
details
yeah,
in
100%.
on their pages about such history.
Mm-hmm. And like
And
even just
I'm
the
not surprised.
indigenous
Oh,
history too. Like
yeah, of
that's a
course.
huge part, and we don't learn, even though it is in like school curriculum, we learn next to nothing.
Hmm.
Not even scratching the surface, not even close.
For sure. And I mean, they always say that if you don't learn from history, that you you're destined to repeat it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but then they don't actually teach it to you
Yeah,
properly because they don't want to take accountability.
yeah, that's
And
shame.
it's so one thing that I've always never really understood, and I know it's easier said than done, all this stuff, but this is my personal opinion as someone that does not work in the government. So of course I do not understand everything.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just thinking, like, does it really hurt you to admit or acknowledge the wrongdoing of the government from decades or
Mm-hmm.
maybe even a century ago?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not like we're asking you yourself to take
Yeah,
credit for it.
we're not blaming you specifically. Like we understand that there's history and it's the past. However, like it's weird that you feel so shameful. Like it's it's just weird. Government hands things weird handles things weirdly.
Mm-hmm.
Just terrible.
I remember how exasperated we were when we were reading that website.
Yeah.
And there was this thing, I'm thinking about it, this thing about the Filipino community. Do you remember? It was something about them and the radio.
The radio? How they
Yeah,
have like radio stations?
Yeah, it was something about something about the development of different Asian communities in Canada, and they had barely written anything about the Filipino community, and they wrote something so ridiculous about how Canadians of Filipino origin also established newspapers, magazines, radio stations, and stuff, and that's not something that everyone else did.
Yeah,
they just didn't have anything. Well, it's not that they didn't actually have anything to write, but they just couldn't take credit for anything or couldn't actually touch on the things that happened because they didn't want to. And so they were just making stuff up for space or just writing the most Canadians. Let me see if I can find it.
So stupid.
Yeah, here. Currently, there are a variety of Filipino associations across Canada that foster and participate in community festivals and civic celebrations. Canadians of Filipino origin have also established newspapers, magazines, as well as TV and radio stations.
Literally filler.
Yeah, and the first part of that paragraph is just very surface level thing, talking about things. People from the Philippines began immigrating to Canada in 1931. However, it was not until the 1990s that immigration increased. The Filipinos came to fill gaps in the Canadian labor market. Over the last few decades, Canadians of Filipino origin have established themselves as integral members of urban centers like Toronto, Vancouver, Winnipeg, Montreal, Calgary, and Edmonton. And then it goes into what I just said earlier about Filipino association. So it doesn't actually say anything.
So stupid.
Just
I'm not
a whole
surprised,
lot of nothing.
Not surprised.
Filipino radio station.
Just the poem in general, like the way that they describe like the Philippine people, like half devil, half child, like it's so disgusting and gross. And it's like, where did that come from? Like, obviously, like this is how like basically like any European country treated anyone like that wasn't a European country. But like just seeing that is so like jarring to me. Obviously, I'm not surprised again, but so gross, so disgusting. And just saying like through all the thankless years, just so gross, disgusting. The white man's burden is just so makes me feel gross.
Well, this conversation that we've been having throughout the episode about the white man's burden and white savior complexes, saviorism in general, reminds me a lot of and connects back to Yellow Peril, which is something that we've touched on in many past episodes. And if you are not familiar with what that is, or you weren't here for those episodes, let me give you a little refresher. So the Yellow Peril, also known as Yellow Terror and the Yellow Spectre, is and was a racial color metaphor that depicts the people of East and Southeast Asia as an existential danger, basically to the Western world. And during that time, there was tons of propaganda with posters depicting East and Southeast Asians as rats, as these types of caricatures with bright yellow skin. They looked like tiny evil beings, and they were shown, and we will also show stuff on the screen. They were shown as these very evil, just not really human looking, or they looked subhuman compared to Westerners.
Yeah, and the whole like metaphor of yellow peril has been applied to all of like East and Southeast Asia, but it was originally developed in the 19th century by a Russian sociologist in an essay, and this essay was made to encourage Europeans in taking over China. So,
I mean, this whole idea of Asian people trying to take over the world or just being these evil beings that bring on, I guess, misfortune to the world
mhm,
in Western society, that's still extremely prevalent today. I mean, look at COVID
mhm,
racism
yep,
and the way that Asians have been perceived and the way that they've been treated, mistreated for better words,
yeah,
throughout all of this. I mean, back during the beginning of COVID, if I was on public transportation and I needed to clear my throat, I would do just every fiber of my being, I would try to suppress it or just not let it happen
mhm,
because I was afraid that someone was gonna hurt me if they heard me, like if they heard me cough or if they heard me just like make a sound.
mhm,
And I mean, it happened to other people that made sounds or even just for being Asian
yeah, just for
with a mask
existing.
on. Yeah. And it still happened every day.
Yeah. So if you're thinking like, oh, this is all old propaganda and all old terms outdated, well, maybe the terms are outdated, but the whole concept of it is still very prevalent to this day,
Mm-hmm. What
especially with the pandemic.
I'm glad you bring that up because an interesting argument that has been made against the existence or the issue of racism in general is that sometimes people will say, oh, it's not like today people still shout slurs or use certain terms against each other or that people still do these certain things. But the thing is, it's evolved. It's
Mhm.
not okay. So, I mean, people do still call me certain things. Let's make this very clear. But it's not as common. Now it's more hidden systemic things. For
Mhm.
example, hiring biases.
Yeah. Pay.
Racism doesn't always have to be, hey, I'm gonna go scream at this person or I'm gonna go beat up this person just because of their race. It's not always that outward.
Yeah.
It can be, and it still is. We've seen it happen. You can't, I mean, you could look away, but doesn't mean it's not there.
Mhm.
And I mean, even if, for example, if something had ended, for example, the original Yellow Peril movement, it wasn't that long ago.
No, it
It
really was
really
not.
wasn't. And I mean, it's not like people are being properly taught about it and
Yeah,
talking
no.
about what's to come or what to do to
Mhm.
not repeat this again.
But yeah,
History repeats
hopefully
itself.
hopefully our episode was able to teach some people some new things if you guys have never heard of this or make you guys aware of it because again, as you said, like without any proper education, history will repeat itself and that would be terrible even though we are seeing it repeat itself over and over again.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, our podcast in this episode and other episodes are just starting points
Mm-hmm.
into if you were, for example, to go and research or learn about this, because we're of course not historians.
No.
Although one could make the argument that because we're not historians, you know the demographic of most historians, right?
Yeah.
We might be able to provide certain information or certain perspectives that are suppressed because of the demographic of some historians or many historians.
Yeah.
And with that, thank you so much for tuning in today. As always, feel free to leave a comment down below where you can. If you're on a platform that allows you to do that, let us know if you learned something new today, if you had already known about this before. Let us know your thoughts on white man's burden, white savior complex, the white man's burden poem. Have you read it before? Do you know about it? Do you know about Yellow Peril? Have you heard about any of this in school? I'm gonna assume no. But let us know if you have.
Yeah.
Was it a very altered version? Did they leave a lot of stuff out? Have you heard about Filipino radio station in Canada?
Yeah. Also, if we missed anything, let us know.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like I was saying, what we do is a starting point, or just a small opening into the topics that we talk about.
Yeah. Well, if you guys like this episode and want to stay connected with us, check out our website in the description. It contains links to our streaming platforms such as Spotify, Anchor, Apple Podcasts, and more. Follow us for more behind-the-scenes content, announcements, and other random things we decide to put on there.
See you next time.